What if I told you America's gardens once held secrets? Traditions so vintage, so timeless, that they shaped communities, families, and survival itself. From stone paths that whispered history to herbal corners that healed the sick, these features weren't just decoration, they were lifelines. But as modern landscaping rose, these traditions faded. Forgotten, abandoned, left behind. And yet, each one carries a story, a piece of wisdom waiting to be rediscovered. Welcome to Forgotten Leaf Secrets, where we uncover the lost traditions of America's gardens and reveal the features history tried to erase. The first forgotten tradition takes us back to the 1940s, a time of war, rationing, and survival. When America faced shortages, families didn't wait for government aid, they turned to their backyards. These were the victory gardens. Ordinary lawns transformed into lifelines. Front yards sprouted rows of beans, tomatoes, and carrots. Empty lots became fields of abundance. Even schoolyards and city parks were converted into food sanctuaries. It wasn't just about feeding families, it was about unity. Neighbors shared seeds, swapped harvests, and taught each other how to grow. Children learned to plant alongside parents, and communities discovered resilience in the soil beneath their feet. By the end of the war, victory gardens produced millions of tons of food, proof that forgotten traditions could sustain a nation in its darkest hour. But as peace returned and supermarkets rose, these gardens faded. The lawns grew back, the soil was silenced, and the tradition was left behind, waiting for us to remember its power. The second forgotten tradition takes us deeper into America's gardens, where beauty was never the only purpose. Hidden in corners, beside fences, or near the kitchen door, families once cultivated herbal healing gardens, small sanctuaries of medicine grown from the soil. Mint for digestion, chamomile for sleep, echinacea to strengthen immunity, lavender to calm the mind. Every plant carried a purpose, every leaf a cure. These weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. In a time before pharmacies, before endless aisles of pills, the garden itself was the doctor. Mothers passed recipes to daughters, grandfathers taught sons which herbs to boil, and neighbors shared remedies that healed entire communities. But as modern medicine rose, these herbal corners faded. The mortar and pestle gave way to factory pills, and the wisdom of the soil was silenced. What was once common knowledge became folklore, dismissed as superstition, left behind in the rush toward progress. Yet today, the herbs still grow, waiting in the wild, sprouting in forgotten corners, whispering the same cures they offered centuries ago. A reminder that America's gardens were more than decoration. They were pharmacies of the earth. The third forgotten tradition rises above the soil. The garden arbors that once framed America's yards like gateways to another world. Made of wood or wrought iron, these arched structures weren't just decoration, they were symbols of welcome. Climbing roses, ivy, and grapevines wrapped themselves around the beams, turning every entrance into a living tunnel of fragrance and shade. Families walked beneath them during summer evenings. Children played hide-and-seek around their vines, and visitors were greeted by blossoms cascading overhead. Arbors transformed ordinary gardens into sanctuaries, places where nature and architecture blended seamlessly. But as modern landscaping favored minimalism and concrete, these arbors disappeared. The gateways of green were dismantled, their memory fading into photographs and old journals. Today, only a few remain silent arches, reminding us that gardens were once designed to enchant the soul, not just the eye. The fourth forgotten tradition lies beneath our feet. The stone pathways that once guided families through America's gardens. Each stone was hand-placed, often carried from nearby rivers or quarried from local land. These paths weren't just practical, they were memory lanes. Children ran across them barefoot, neighbors followed them to herbal corners, and visitors traced them to orchards heavy with fruit. Every pathway told a story. The cracks held rainwater, Moss grew between the stones, and generations left their footprints etched into the earth. They were living maps of family history, connecting one part of the garden to another, weaving together daily life with nature's rhythm. But as concrete sidewalks and asphalt driveways spread across America, these stone pathways were abandoned. The artistry of hand-laid trails was silenced, replaced by uniform slabs that carried no memory, no soul. Today, only fragments remain, whispers of a tradition that once turned gardens into timeless journeys. The fifth forgotten tradition stood quietly beside homes. The rain barrels that collected nature's gift drop by drop. Made of wood, iron hoops, or later tin, these barrels captured the sky's generosity. Every storm filled them, every rainfall replenished them, and families relied on their stored water to keep gardens alive during dry spells. They weren't just containers, they were guardians of resilience. Children dipped cups into them, mothers used the water to nourish vegetable rows, and fathers praised the clarity of rain compared to well water. In times of drought, these barrels meant survival. They taught respect for nature's cycles, reminding families that every drop mattered. But as plumbing advanced and hoses became common, rain barrels were dismissed as relics. The practice of saving water faded, and with it, the wisdom of conservation that once defined America's gardens. Now, they stand as forgotten symbols of a time when people lived in harmony with the sky above. The sixth forgotten tradition stretches across the horizon. The orchard rows that once defined America's gardens and homesteads. Families planted apple, pear, and cherry trees in neat lines, not just for beauty, but for survival. Each row was a promise: blossoms in spring, shade in summer, fruit in autumn, and firewood in winter. Children climbed branches to taste the first apples of the season. Mothers preserved jars of jam that lasted through the cold months, and fathers pruned carefully, knowing each cut shaped the harvest to come. Orchards weren't luxuries, they were lifelines, feeding families and entire communities. But as industrial farms rose and supermarkets replaced self-sufficiency, these orchard rows vanished from backyards. The tradition of planting trees for generations faded, leaving behind only scattered memories of gardens that once bore fruit for decades. The seventh forgotten tradition lies beneath the ground. The garden wells that once quenched thirst and nourished crops. Before plumbing and pipelines, families dug wells at the edge of their gardens, drawing water with buckets, ropes, and hand-cranked pulleys. Every drop carried meaning. Children laughed as they peered into the dark depths. Mothers filled clay jugs to water herbs, and fathers measured the strength of the rope that held their family's lifeline. The well was more than water, it was community. Neighbors gathered around it, shared stories, and trusted it to sustain them through droughts and scorching summers. But as modern plumbing spread, these wells were sealed, covered, or abandoned. The ritual of lowering a bucket into the earth disappeared, and with it, the intimate bond between families and the water that sustained their gardens. Now, only crumbling stones and forgotten rings remain, echoes of a tradition that once kept America's gardens alive. The eighth forgotten tradition lies underground. The root cellars that once preserved America's harvests through the harshest winters. Families dug cool, dark chambers beneath their homes or gardens, lining them with stone or timber. Inside, baskets of potatoes, carrots, onions, and apples rested in silence, protected from frost and heat. These cellars were more than storage, they were survival vaults. Children carried lanterns down to fetch food, mothers organized shelves of jars and baskets, and fathers reinforced walls to keep the cold steady. Every trip into the cellar was a reminder that nature's abundance could last beyond the season. The ninth forgotten tradition buzzed with life. The garden beehives that once stood proudly at the edge of America's yards. Made of straw skeps or wooden boxes, these hives were guardians of both food and beauty. Bees pollinated orchards, fertilized flowers, and gifted families with golden honey, nature's sweetest medicine. Children watched in awe as bees danced in the air. Mothers used honey to soothe sore throats, and fathers carefully tended the hives, knowing their gardens depended on these tiny workers. The hum of bees was the heartbeat of the land, a rhythm that kept gardens alive. But as industrial honey production rose and fear of stings spread, backyard hives disappeared. The partnership between families and bees was severed, and with it, the intimate bond that once sustained America's gardens. Now, only scattered wild colonies remain, echoes of a tradition where every garden was alive with wings and sweetness. The 10th forgotten tradition stood tall at the edges of America's gardens. The wooden garden fences that once defined boundaries and protected life within. Made of cedar, oak, or pine, these fences weren't just barriers, they were guardians. They kept wandering animals away from tender crops, marked the pride of ownership, and gave gardens a sense of sacred enclosure. Children painted them white in summer, mothers hung baskets of flowers upon them, and fathers repaired each post with care. Knowing the fence was more than wood, it was a symbol of resilience. Neighbors leaned against them to share stories, and vines climbed their rails, turning protection into beauty. But as chain link and concrete walls replaced them, the charm of wooden fences faded. The tradition of crafting boundaries with care was lost, leaving behind only photographs of gardens once framed by living wood. The 11th forgotten tradition thrived in gatherings. The community seed swaps that once united America's gardeners. In town squares, churchyards, and school halls, families brought envelopes of seeds, corn, beans, squash, and flowers to exchange with neighbors. Every swap was more than trade, it was trust. Seeds carried stories, resilience, and the promise of future harvests. Children learned the names of plants from elders. Mothers shared heirloom varieties passed down for generations, and fathers proudly offered seeds that had survived harsh seasons. These swaps built communities, ensuring diversity in gardens and strengthening bonds between families. But as commercial seed companies rose and packaged hybrids dominated shelves, the tradition of swapping faded. The wisdom of sharing was replaced by buying, and the heritage of seeds was silenced. Yet even today, heirloom seeds whisper of those forgotten gatherings, proof that gardens were once sustained by community, not commerce. The 12th forgotten tradition stood silently in the sunlight. The garden sundials that once told time through shadows. Carved from stone or cast in brass, these sundials were more than ornaments. They were guardians of rhythm. Families watched the shadow move across the dial, marking hours for watering, harvesting, or resting. Children learned the passage of time not from ticking clocks, but from the sun itself. Every garden sundial carried artistry, engraved numbers, poetic inscriptions, and designs that blended science with beauty. They reminded families that life flowed with the sun's arc, that nature's clock was the truest measure of time. But as mechanical clocks and wristwatches spread, sundials were dismissed as relics. The tradition of reading shadows faded, leaving behind only weathered stones in forgotten corners. Yet even today, the sun still casts its truth, waiting for us to remember the elegance of time told by light. The 13th forgotten tradition glowed with fire. The outdoor bread ovens that once stood at the heart of America's gardens. Built from brick or clay, these ovens were more than cooking tools. They were gathering places. Families baked loaves that fed neighbors. Mothers prepared pies that carried the scent of harvest, and fathers tended flames that warmed entire communities. Children waited eagerly for the first slice. Neighbors shared recipes, and the garden became a place of celebration. The oven wasn't just about food, it was about unity, about turning harvests into meals that bound families together. But as modern kitchens and factory bread replaced tradition, these ovens fell silent. The smoke no longer curled above gardens. The laughter around the fire faded, and the ritual of baking outdoors was forgotten. Now only crumbling bricks remain, echoes of a time when bread was baked beneath the open sky, and gardens fed both body and soul. The 14th forgotten tradition rises like a crown above America's gardens. The gazebos that once stood as symbols of leisure and beauty. Built from wood, painted white, or carved with intricate detail, these open-air shelters were more than decoration. They were gathering places. Families sat beneath them on summer evenings, children played games in their shade, and neighbors shared tea while the breeze carried the scent of roses. Gazebos turned gardens into sanctuaries, places where nature and community blended seamlessly. But as modern patios and indoor living took over, gazebos were abandoned. The tradition of building these airy shelters faded, leaving behind only photographs of gardens that once held spaces for joy, reflection, and togetherness. Now, the few that remain whisper of a time when gardens were not just for growing, but for living. The 15th forgotten tradition lies in the seeds themselves. The heirloom plant varieties that once filled America's gardens with diversity and resilience. Tomatoes of every shape and color, beans with stripes and speckles, corn that glowed in hues of red and gold. Each variety carried a story, passed down through generations. Families saved seeds from year to year. Mothers taught children which plants thrived best in their soil. And fathers proudly grew crops that had fed their ancestors. Heirloom plants weren't just food. They were heritage, living archives of flavor, strength, and survival. But as hybrid seeds and commercial farming spread, these varieties disappeared. The richness of diversity was replaced by uniformity, and the wisdom of preserving seeds was forgotten. Yet even today, heirloom seeds survive in hidden corners, waiting to be revived, reminders that America's gardens once carried the colors of history in every harvest. We've uncovered 15 forgotten traditions, each one a piece of America's garden heritage, each one a story of resilience, beauty, and wisdom. From pathways and wells to sundials and seeds, these features remind us that gardens were never just about plants. They were about survival, community, and soul. If these secrets inspired you, don't let them fade again. Like and subscribe to join us as we continue unlocking nature's hidden vaults. Because every tradition we rediscover brings us closer to the wisdom history tried to erase.